Suzanne Barron here, founder of Christ, the True Light. The Suffering and Sacrifice of Jesus, a detailed examination. You can read this at christthetruelight.com under the Biblical Enlightenment section of my blog. Okay, the Suffering and Sacrifice of Jesus, a detailed examination. The account of Jesus' trials, humiliation, and crucifixion has captivated theologians, historians, and medical professionals alike, welcoming examinations from countless viewpoints. Medically speaking, the string of events leading up to his death paints a heartbreaking story of physical endurance and suffering. Diving into the details, we witness a series of horrific events. The brutal scourging that lacerated his body, the piercing crown of thorns on his scalp, and the nails driven through his hands and feet. I want to warn you, this discussion may be difficult to read, as it vividly portrays the brutality of Roman execution methods. Please be prepared as we explore these events with great sensitivity. By the time he was crucified, Jesus had been up about 36 hours without any sleep. We know from biblical accounts that Jesus was an early riser, since the Gospels recount numerous instances where he woke up early to pray. We have no reason to believe he did anything different than that the day he had his last meal with his disciples. He probably woke early that morning, spent the day accordingly, and later had dinner with the disciples during the Last Supper in the upper room. When he was captured at the Garden of Gethsemane, he was led through the old city of Jerusalem and underwent at least 2 trials. It was not until the next day, about daybreak, that he was hung on the cross and hung there throughout the day. Between the time he arose and the time he actually died on the cross, a period of about 36 hours had passed, with no rest and no sleep. Maybe you haven't thought about how far Jesus actually walked about the old city of Jerusalem. We know he was led from the chief priest's house to Herod's, and then to Pilate's during the time he was being tried. And we know he was led about the old city of Jerusalem. If we add it up, he walked about 2.5 miles that last night. Also, as best as we can determine from historical records, Jesus carried his cross about 1/3 of a mile, give or take, before he collapsed and wasn't able to carry it anymore. These are just a few of the physical strains that would have added up to cause stress on any individual. The next thing I want to talk about is a phenomenon called hematidrosis. This is a very rare medical phenomenon that has only been recorded about 106 times in world medical literature, and is only seen in people who are under tremendous stress and agony. In hematidrosis, a person actually excludes blood from every sweat gland of their body. Each sweat gland has a small capillary that surrounds it. And in I can't pronounce the word, I can spell it. Hematidrosis, that small capillary ruptures. As it bursts, the person actually bleeds into their sweat glands. Instead of perspiring sweat, they actually perspire blood. The Bible gives us an excellent description of this phenomenon, saying that Jesus' sweat became as drops of blood. Every pore of Jesus' body oozed and drained blood. Jesus was a man just as any of us. He had the spirit of prophecy dwelling inside of him, and was in fellowship with the Word. He knew the terrible fate that lay ahead of him, and knew the task he was handed to do, and the mission he had to fulfill. He knew he had to die as a subliminal God, that we needed to see sin murder God. Still, he dreaded this agonizing death and torture that lay ahead of him just a few hours, just as much as any of us would. We know he prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane, Father, if it be your will, let this cup pass from me. But he submitted his will to the Spirit within him. In the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus was under as much anxiety and physical stress from an emotional standpoint that we could expect any human to experience, knowing that in just a few hours he would be delivered over to one of the most agonizing and brutal deaths ever recorded in history. So why didn't Jesus bleed to death if he bled out of every pore of his sweat gland, out of every sweat gland of his body? In Israel, this time of the year would have had warm days and cold nights. It was this cool night air that probably caused Jesus' damp skin, covered with sweat and blood, to chill, causing the capillaries to constrict and stop bleeding. The cold air causes the blood vessels to constrict and causes the blood loss to be minimum. But by the time Jesus was taken by the soldiers from the Garden of Gethsemane, he probably had a mixture of sweat and blood all over his entire body surface. This would have been a sight to behold. Let's talk about the scourging he went through. Scourging was a horrible form of torture that Roman citizens were forbade to be scourged. Only slaves and traitors could be scourged. It was one of the worst punishments that the Romans had to inflict on a human body. Typically, the victim was stripped completely naked and tied by his wrist to a post or a wall with his back exposed. He was then whipped from the back of his arms down to his shoulders and back, across his bare bottoms, down the back of his legs and calves, all the way down to his heels by 2 Roman legionnaires, one on either side, alternating blows. Historical accounts tell us that the traditional scourging consisted of 39 lashes. If you can, I want you to imagine 2 large, strong, burly Roman legionnaires, someone that we would equate to a pro football player today, with a wooden handle whip about 18 inches long, and had 9 leather thongs, similar to what we call a cat o' nine tails. The 9 leather thongs were about 6 to 7 feet long, and at the end of each thong was a lead shot, like a sinker you would use to go fishing. Attached to the lead shots were pieces of sheep and cattle bone. And the idea of these small pieces of bone was that as the Roman legionnaires would beat the victims, snapping his wrist would cause the weight of the metal shot to dig into the back. As the sheep bone lacerated the skin and actually dug into the surface of the skin, so as the skilled and trained legion whipped his wrist, the cattle bone would literally lift small shards of skeletal muscle out through the skin, leaving small ribbons of muscles about 2 inches long hanging through the skin. With one lash of this whip, one thong alone would make a cut of about 2 inches long and about 3/4 of an inch deep. To put that into medical terms, that's a cut that would take about 20 stitches to close. So with one lash, one swing, a total of 9 lacerations could be inflicted on the victim from the 9 thongs of the whip, with lacerations 2 inches long and about 3/4 to 1 inch deep. With just one blow alone, the Roman legionnaires could inflict enough wounds to take about 180 stitches to close. One swing, just one. If you multiply that by 39 times, these 2 Roman legionnaires inflicted enough lacerations to take about 2,000 stitches to close. This gives you an idea of the amount of physical trauma that was inflicted upon Jesus' body just from the scourging. Again, you'd ask, why didn't Jesus bleed to death? And again, you'd have to remember that this was done in the cold of night air. The very thing that causes blood vessels and capillaries to constrict would have caused the blood loss from this beating to be minimal. As previously mentioned, the purpose of the lead weight of the cattle bone at the end of the thong was to lift skeletal muscles out of the skin. Imagine having a cut on your skin with an inch of muscle pulled out through the cut exposed to the night air, similar to a stab wound. These muscles are pulled back through the skin as if stabbed with sharp objects like a stick. The purpose was for the victim to be hung on the cross in the heat of the day. Birds would then land on him and actually pick and pull at these pieces of muscle, just like a robin trying to pull a worm out of the ground. Frequently, how long a person actually survived on the cross during a crucifixion was determined by how severely he was scourged, and sometimes they would beat a man nearly to death before they put him on the cross, and he would only live a few hours. However, the majority of time, scourging was intended for public humiliation and embarrassment, not death, because it was such an inhumane method of torture. We know that Jesus was beaten in the face and head as he was mocked. I can assure you, by the time Jesus was crucified after his beatings, it's almost certain that both of his eyes were swollen shut, and no doubt his nose was pouring blood. Jesus was tied, held, and beaten in the face by these 2 strong Roman legionnaires. There's no doubt that his lips were tattered like paper, and some of his teeth were knocked loose or even knocked out. You might ask if his jawbones were broken. Normally they would be, but not in Jesus' case, and I'll tell you why in a few minutes. During Jesus' trial and humiliation, we also know that a crown of thorn was plaited and placed on his head. This was done to mock him for being king of the Jews. These thorns are about 1 inch to 1.5 to 2 inches long, and they're as sharp as ice picks. It was customary to take a small 3 or 4 foot long reed and slap the thorns on top of the head of the victim to drive the thorns into the skull. These thorns laid upon someone's head and then tapped down with a reed were hard enough to penetrate the outer bone of the skull. Imagine the bleeding from 300 or 400 puncture wounds in the scalp and around the forehead from these thorns. Imagine the pain. So before Jesus' crucifixion ever begins, before they ever gave him his cross to head out to Calvary, his face had been beaten to a pulp. No doubt his eyes were swollen shut, his nose was bloodied, and I remind you that every pore in his skin has wept and oozed blood. His arms, backs, buttocks, and the back of his legs were literally torn to shreds from the scourging. Every visible surface of Jesus was covered and caked with blood. Let's talk about the cross for a minute. We know that from Corinthian and Roman history, the crosses were usually in two parts. First, the crossbar. From very good historical accounts, can be estimated to have weighed 125 to 150 pounds, and it had to be about the size of a cross tie. They are what you would expect to see on a railroad cross tie: rough, unplanned, unfinished pieces of wood with splinters and spikes and rough places all over them. When the victim's final trial and condemnation had taken place, to maximize the shame and suffering, it was customary to tie the crossbar to the victim, having him carry it all the way through the city from the point of condemnation to the point of execution. To add to the ultimate humiliation, the victim had to bear the cross naked, forced to stagger through the streets, scorched and beaten, with a crossbar tied to their arms. Imagine how humiliating and agonizing this must have been for Jesus. The other part of the cross was an upright part, which is just like a post in the ground. Every major city at the time had an area outside of their gates where they would perform crucifixions. It wasn't only a form of execution, but it was also a form of entertainment. Someone condemned to the cross would bear the crossbar through the streets to the point of crucifixion, and once there, would be thrown onto the ground. Nails would then be driven through their hands into the crossbar. Then two forks, something similar to pitchforks, would be placed around each end of the crossbar, and they would be boosted up at the crossbar. Boosted up, and the crossbar hung up on the top of the upright post. Once there, they would be braced to the upright post. Both feet would be then nailed to the footpiece. Sorry, the television is distracting me. The Romans practiced crucifixions for hundreds of years. They perfected the art of pain and suffering. How can a man have spikes through his hands and feet and not bleed to death? The Romans figured out that if they had drove the spike through a man's wrist, right at the middle, they would avoid hitting the arteries and veins. If you go back and look at the Hebrew word for hand, it's inclusive from the fingertips to about where your wristwatch crosses your wrist. So the hand didn't necessarily mean the palm. You cannot drive a spike through a man's palm and hang him by it without it pulling right out between his fingers. It's an accepted medical fact that the muscles in your hand is not strong enough to support your body weight. In order to be able to drive the spikes through the hands, Jesus' hand, they had to drive them through at the wrist. There's a very strong ligament called the transverse carpal ligament that's strong enough to support the body weight. The Romans figured out that if they came about where the crease in the wrist is and drove the spikes through this area, they would miss the radial artery. This is the artery people cut when they try to kill themselves, by cutting the wrist. It's right where the doctor takes your pulse. They would also miss the ulnar artery over their little finger side. What they would do is they would drive the nail through the biggest nerve in the hand, called the median nerve. If anyone reading this has ever had carpal tunnel syndrome, you know how uncomfortable any inflammation or irritation to that median nerve can be. When the median nerve is transacted, it gives about a sensation of having an electrical cattle prod struck to your wrist and a constant electrical shock going through your hand. It causes the finger to claw. In essence, the Romans devised a way that they could drive spikes through a man's hand and not lose one drop of blood, while maximizing the amount of pain and suffering that a man can endure. The Romans did the same thing with the feet. They calculated where they could drive a spike through both of the men's feet and not cause blood that would cause a man to bleed to death. The spike would have been placed between the first and second metatarsal bones, missing the dorsal artery. There again, they drove the spike through the feet with no blood loss. The spike misses the artery but does hit the plantar nerves, thereby causing the same horrible shock sensation in his feet as he has in his hands. Let's talk about Jesus hanging on the cross. When hanging by their arms, a crucifixion victim's body weight causes their diaphragm to function like bellows. As the diaphragm drops into the abdomen, it pulls in air. So someone hanging on the cross had no difficulty whatsoever pulling air into their lungs. The tough part for people hanging on the cross was breathing out. In order for a crucifixion victim to exhale, they would have to pull up against the spikes and push with their hands and push up against the spikes with their feet. And I want to remind you, here's Jesus hanging here on the cross, likely naked in front of the entire city of Jerusalem. And I've already described the condition of his back. You see, every time Jesus took a breath, that his tattered, lacerated, and riddled back was dragged and scraped across that splinters, rough knobs, and spikes protruding from the cross. Each time he breathed out, each time he uttered a word, he would pull up with his arms and push up with his legs. He couldn't say more than 3 or 4 words at a time, because when you talk, you only talk as you breathe out, not as you breathe in. See, every word Jesus spoke on the cross was spoken as he was pulling up against the nails and dragged his back against the cross. What did he say? He said, "Behold your mother." And then he said, "Behold your son." Then he said, "Behold your mother." Jesus knew he was about finished in this world. Finally, he said, "It is finished." When he said it is finished, that's the last time he pulled up with his hands and pushed up with his feet, dragging his back across the cross as he hung there naked before the city of Jerusalem, in total shame and humiliation, convicted, tortured, and condemned for standing boldly for the truth, for his testimony of the spirit of prophecy, the audible word of Christ. If you go back and look at historical accounts, you find that people actually lived on the cross, crucified for up to 6 days. If you can, imagine a man hanging on a cross outside a gate from a city, with birds pecking in his eyes and roosting on his head, picking at his exposed skeletal muscle as he hangs there naked as a spectacle for the whole city to see. That was the point of this. It was part of the shame and humiliation that a man hang there so people could come by for a day or two, stand, mark, and jeer, and shout accusations, railings, and blasphemy at him. The idea was to make him suffer as much as possible. Crucifixion was never intended to kill anyone. It was only intended to make a human being suffer as much as possible before being inflicted, or that could be inflicted upon him before killing him by breaking his legs. Crucifraction is what they would do when they simply grew tired of watching this agony and suffering, or when they had something better to do and wanted to end the crucifixion. They would take a spear and swing it like a ball and bat and hit the victim in the shins to break the shin bones. They would break the tibia and then the fibular bones, and many times they would have to beat the legs for 5 to 10 minutes until they can finally break the shin bones. It takes a lot of force to break your shin bones. With the shin bones broken, the victim can no longer push up or breathe air. Why didn't they break Jesus' legs? If you look at Psalms 34:20, it says not a bone in his body was broken. This was why Jesus' jaw, nose, and cheekbones should have been broken, but couldn't have been. Psalms 34:20 wouldn't let that take place, and that's why the Roman centurion didn't break his legs, because the Bible says not a bone in his body was broken. I want you to see the control in these men. Christ is in all of us. There's something that would not allow these men to break his bones. Prophecy had to be fulfilled. The spirit inside of those men would not allow him to break the bones. When they grew tired of you and got tired of the situation, they would break your legs. I'm getting a migraine, so just in case you're wondering why I'm sitting here doing this. It's a bad time to read this, but I'm going with it anyways. Then in about 4 or 6 minutes, you'd smother to death because you could no longer push up with your legs. You would lay there sagging. I didn't finish that. See, I'm messing up. Wouldn't let that take place. And that's why the Roman centurion didn't break his legs, because the Bible says not a bone in his body was to be broken. And that was totally uncharacteristic of the crucifixion, because that's how many of the crucifixion victims died. When they grew tired of you and got bored with the situation, they would break your legs. And then in about 4 to 6 minutes, you'd smother to death because you could no longer push up with your legs. You would lay there sagging, unable to breathe out, and you were asphyxiated in about 4 to 6 minutes. That's how the 2 thieves died. But Jesus was dead already. What happens in John 19? What did they do when they went to the first thief? The Roman centurion broke his legs. What did he do when he went to the second thief? He broke his legs. But when the centurion went to Jesus, the Bible says he was dead already. Now, why would a young, healthy man be dead after being on the cross for 6 hours? That's absolutely no medical explanation for it at all. Jesus had no business being dead at this point. He should have been alive just like the other 2. He wasn't beaten to the point of death, and his blood loss was minimal. And we know he wasn't in shock because every word he said on the cross made sense. He identified his mother standing at a distance from the foot of the cross. He was able to see enough to identify her and identify one of the disciples as well. And everything he said was coherent. He was not out of his mind, and he was not having a nervous breakdown, and he wasn't even in shock from blood loss. Jesus was perfectly coherent and sane up until the moment he died. When the crucifixion When the centurion saw that Jesus was dead already, he thrust the spear into Jesus' side. The Bible says in Zechariah 12:10 that we may look upon the one whom they pierced. The spear thrust was a biblical prophecy fulfilled, and that was why Jesus was dead already. See, Christ had a plan. We were to look upon the one whom they pierced. Spear piercing was uncharacteristic of the crucifixion as well. Zechariah had to be fulfilled, and the Bible says blood and water came out of Jesus' side after spear was thrust in. Now, if you take a unit of blood drained out of a human body, put it in a quart jar, and set it on top of a desk for about 30 minutes, the blood cells begin to settle out and the plasma rises to the top. The plasma separated from the blood cells. So when the soldier thrust the spear into Jesus' side, Jesus had already been dead for about 30 to 45 minutes. Maybe you've never thought about that. When the Roman centurion went to him to break his legs, he was dead already. They couldn't break his legs because the Bible says in Psalms, not a bone in his body shall be broken. Why then would the soldier thrust the spear into his side when other crucifixion victims had not had spears thrust into their side? Because Zechariah told us hundreds of years ago that we'd look upon the one we'd pierce, a prophecy given by the Spirit, and what came out? Blood and water. There's enough medical evidence there that Jesus had been dead for at least a half an hour or more. All right.